Chad. Question for Chad. So you're doing all this sort of stuff around farm planning. If you go digital, are you making sure that across the country that's going to be integrated with other regional councils in terms of being able to data share as well?
Yeah, so we're looking, I'm also, as part of that Link 25, that's been driven from another project, which is looking at how, as the regional sector, we get our data definitions aligned, and then how do we get potentially a platform, and I say platform not from a technical sense, but how do we get a process where all the regional sectors, we're only collecting the data once, not 16 different times. So for vendors, that means it's one API to deal with, not 16 APIs. Because to drive to drive compliance costs down, we need to make sure that consistent information is being captured in a consistent manner.
Yep.
Just a question around that risk. Like, all of this data is absolutely magnificent to have, but we're seeing a lot more emergence in, the cybersecurity risk. Any thoughts or comments around how we could potentially combat that going forward in this integrated farm planning space?
First of all, way outside my realm. We do have to look at, with all of this data being collected, we do have to look at how it's stored, who's got access to it, who's got the permissions, because all of that is a big risk that we're going to have to face. It's also, by having the data in 6 different places, to use Blair's example, we're actually exposing it more. By getting the sources into known sources, trusted sources, you then minimise some of that risk. What's that?
The hospital board.
Oh, the hospital we're being expert at it now.
Now, yeah. Gavin, stand up and yell.
So let's say we do collect all this data and everybody can access it. Can the panel describe some vision around how farmers would benefit from that and how New Zealand Inc. would benefit from that as well?
So, first benefit is that duplication of entry. You reduce the duplication of entry. Blair, Fraser, Dan have got more time out on farm doing what they want to be doing. The benefit for if we've got good quality data, we know the source of it, we can then start to use that. It turns into information. We can use that, and we can use that to help inform what research we want, which then helps inform what information is going back out on farm. We can let's see, where else will I go with it? We can start setting up trusted sources of data that people can use, and then you think about from a research point of view, if they could tap into it, it's not another burden on a farmer to provide that information. It could already be there. So.
I think it's different for each type of data you're kind of talking about. Like what we're working on with you, for example, there's a real benefit for an on-farm system. FarmX shows that very clearly. If we can use that to lower the risk on a farming business, or help them predict, or even get a fair estimate of where something is going to go in the future, then that's still better than no information at all. That's the first point I'd like to make. Brian had a good point before, Mr. Taihoro. We said even, I think it was 42% of dairy farmers at the moment currently measure their pasture growth. I've quoted you on that, mate. So. It's recorded now, it must be true. Yeah. What I mean is, for example, last year when we were working in the Hawke's Bay and we're working really closely with Beef and Lamb and Dairy NZ with you guys, once we got farmers into, in a really bad drought situation where they were up the creek basically, once we got them using a bit of farm planning, doing a quick check of a feed budget, and then some of them went on to do a bigger, more in-depth feed budget, they realised what they hadn't been doing and how useful it was, because all that preparation work that they could have done earlier wasn't done, which was half the reason they were in the problem that they were. We've heard the loose hern word used a lot today, but it's got a real place in drought planning. Everybody knows that. It was in 3 or 4 presentations today. And we've got real case studies now that James's team did for us with Ag First that we've used down the Hawke's Bay. We've just done one for top of the South Island, haven't we, James? Well, in a similar situation where we've gone, look, here's where we've used data and information that you've provided into an industry body or into a system or into a piece of software, and here's how we can actually bring that back out to your community and give them options where they possibly didn't have any before. So I think those types of benefits are huge.
Yeah, I think the key benefits are saving time, avoiding duplication, and ultimately allowing for better decisions all round. And I think the other area that's going to be increasingly important is that regulation space and allowing good, robust data to be used that the farmers are going to have to provide anyway, but if they can have it in one place, it's going to be a huge advantage. If I can turn the question around slightly and think about what's going to take to get what we're talking about, perhaps a database of farmers' farm level information. And I think it's got to be driven by farmers. And so they, I think, have to collectively somehow, and I know that's a real challenge, demand that in some way. I think if it's driven from a commercial aspect or from a government perspective or any other perspective for that matter, I don't think it will work. I think it has to be driven from the farmer, and therefore the benefits have to be obvious and direct for the farmer.
Just adding to that, what I should have done is invited a person along from a catchment group who's, maybe organising one of those. And I think we've got one here. And she's looking into her hand. But Anna, how do you think the process is going? Do you think that farmers are going to have some valuable information at the end of this?
Well, I was sitting here trying to think of a question around, I think it was to Matt, probably that qualitative and quantitative information and how you're going to potentially try and tell farmers or influence farmers what's in the plan to make it more quantitative. So I'm at a level working with quite a lot of farmers at a lower level and trying to just get increased participation in farm planning and not probably looking at that regulatory side. I'm really driving it from the benefit on farm of having a farm plan, and that's been going quite well. I'm quite nervous about how when we want to use them, I'm understanding what you're saying, that there's a value there with the information we're collecting, but how we're going to make that into useful data, if you like, and I kind of feel like there's a big gap, and it makes me nervous as someone that's promoting farm planning, a farmer that's promoting farm planning to other farmers in my community, and how that's going to look like. I think if you, when you get the right background and you talk about farm planning in the right way, it is, farmers get it, they buy into it, and I think there's a great opportunity, and I just hope that we don't butcher it by creating data, quantitative data out of it. So there's quite a, absolutely, Matt, it needs to be farmer driven for sure, and I get that's a really, really big challenge. Matt, is that what you wanted?
Yes, it is. Matt, how are you going to get farmer driven?
Well, that's a really good.
He was asking
good question. I asked the question. I didn't provide the answer.
He'll have to at some point invite a farmer. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Matt, you got a plan?
I don't know. I think there's one group that might not be here today, and that's Fed Farmers. That could be a collective group that could help in this space.
Sure. Yeah.
But having said that, I mean, there are some really strong and good farmer leaders that could take this up if they chose to, and they could work with their sector groups as well to make this, or try and push this a bit further.
Yeah.
I'll just address quickly the quantitative data piece. I mean, what we're doing really is trying to provide a bit of a snapshot of where farms are at, current performance, if you like, and thinking about the elements within a farm environment plan. There's so much qualitative stuff in there, which is fantastic, and that tells a really good story for an individual farm, and I guess collectively it still tells a story as well. All we're trying to do is provide a pictorial, I suppose, of where farms are at in general, so that you can look at that diagram and say, hey, these things are actually working quite well, and these things need a bit more detail or need a bit more work. But you then dig back down into the qualitative, so it's like a summary, really.
Cool. Linda, were you? I thought. Oh, you're just.
Graham, I just want to make a couple of comments. I have some concerns at times when I'm hearing all of the speakers talking about this is going to feed into this and this is going to feed into that. I'm particularly concerned that we have models like Overseer that people have hung their hat on that don't have the transparency that's required. I think Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment made it very clear that we need to open the hood on that to allow people to see it. And so there's not a lot of trust between what government is doing and what the farmers are seeing. And unless that trust is increased, then I think you're going to be really struggling to get engagement from the farmers. The tools they've been given at the moment, the regulatory tools, are being imposed on them, and they fail some of the primary requirements for a model. They're not transparent, they're not open, we can't see what's under the hood. So there's got to be some engagement in those sorts of conversations to be sorted. And then we need to recognise that models do different things depending on what you're trying to achieve. So a model that you're developing to work with an individual farmer is quite different from feeding information to beef and lamb to try and get them to be able to explain and inform policy around, for example, the amount of riparian planting and biodiversity that's on farm. And for us to look at that as a country at what the landscape level is, we need more of the sorts of information that's generated from SMAP and other land use classes. So there's not one size fits all, but the key thing is it must be transparent. If it's not transparent, you will not get buy-in.
Yep, so that's a discussion in the industry right now, isn't it, about getting transparency through Overseer. There's a lot of questions I've got here that I want to ask, but I've run out of time. But it does tell me that we're hitting the mark. You know, there's a sense, I think there's a sense here that there's a lot happening, and, you know, if it doesn't all land right, then it won't work. And I guess then we'll look back and say, hey, it's landed like this and it didn't work. What do we do for step 2? So the more we can kind of minimise that, the better. But I think that from what I hear, we're going to be doing a bit of that. Okay, thank you, panel.